Welcome to Interdependent Study, our podcast where we engage in the learning and unlearning work for collective liberation. I'm Damien.
And I'm Aaron. Thank you so much for joining us today. Each week we'll bring something new to the table and discuss our thoughts and feelings about it through the lenses of who we are and where we can go for a more just society.
We want Interdependent Study to be a space where we're always learning with one another. And Aaron, you're up this week in our 201st episode.
201. 201.
That is as exciting.
Yeah.
What are you bringing to the table today?
I'm bringing episode 2 of Eyes on the Prize 3. This episode is called Trapped.
Yes.
And as I mentioned last week, it focuses on the laws and policies of the late 80s and early 90s that were leading to mass incarceration. So we see the episode start in Los Angeles as there were regular gang confrontations, which were, quote, addressed by the police, which was really just creating further tension between gangs purposefully. And then the story shifts to D.C. and drug laws and enforcement policies of police, prosecutors, and politicians. And so we see how the choices to enforce drug laws on low-level dealers and people who are using didn't address any of the underlying issues.
Right.
So the concerns have never been addressed.
How about that?
And so I want to talk about the parallel in this episode. We see gangs fighting each other and cops fighting with gangs in the first half. Mm-hmm. And then in the second half, we see this so-called drug war, which again is defenders versus prosecutors and politicians versus people. And in neither of these scenarios are the underlying issues addressed.
Right.
Everything we saw in this episode is a manifestation of a deeper problem, which is generally poverty.
You're right. Yep.
Poverty through organized abandonment, to reference Ruth.
Yeah,
more.
very good.
And these are people living in places that have been intentionally ignored or left behind. We saw in episode 1 of this series this concept of planned shrinkage.
Right.
And this is a different version of that same thing. What happens when people are neglected?
Yeah.
Lots of things, but none of them are positive. And so rather than figuring out what the source of that neglect is and that organized abandonment, we had politicians, police, and prosecutors throwing people away on long prison sentences and trying to address the symptoms without addressing the underlying conditions.
Yeah. Wow. That might be your best introduction yet.
It took 200 episodes. You got there.
It was so good. Yeah. You know, for me, this entire episode of this incredible docuseries was just a great example of how policing and the criminal punishment system weren't successful at all in tackling the true issues at play or the heart of the problem in either of these cities and certainly across the country. And I think you're right. It's absolutely a case study for what poverty through organized abandonment is. That's great analysis there. So yeah, for me, this was an incredible episode of this docuseries, and to kind of build off of what you talked about, it just reinforced what continues to be the case today, and that is that our law enforcement system and policing and our criminal punishment system have never been about true public safety, right? Or caring for the welfare of people and communities. This was the case back in the 1980s and 90s, you know, as this docuseries focuses on, and unfortunately, it's still the case today. And the examples in this episode of the government and law enforcement launching initiatives like Operation Hammer in LA or Operation Clean Sweep or the literally multi-million-dollar investment in the war on drugs were quite simply never about addressing what was at the core of the issues plaguing our communities at the time. And we saw that in the ways that some of the officials or leaders featured in this episode and through archival footage talked about people. I think it was the police chief in LA who referred to Black people and then referred to, quote, normal people. Like, what is that? You know, and there were so many moments throughout the film where I was like, this is just despicable, right? The way in which we're referring to people.
Well, and that moment where that police chief was talking about it, he's talking about how, from his view, Black people are more susceptible to dying in a chokehold.
Yes.
Because something about their veins don't open up.
Yes.
Like quote unquote normal people that he said. And I just, that was baffling because you mean you choke people and they die. And you think that happens more to Black people than other normal people?
Right.
To use your words?
Yeah.
There's
so much that's wrong about that thinking and that statement and to say it out loud and to be in the position that you're in. I mean, it just... Yeah. And I also think at the core of all of that is this concept, I know you'll appreciate this, of disposability. The disposability of Black people and these communities like the community featured in LA. And so for me, all of it, again, just reinforced, these themes that we have talked about time and time again, and certainly the necessity for abolition, right? Because it showed, this episode showed just how the system has always been poisonous, for lack of a better word.
Yeah. And, one of the things connected to abolition, one of the things that was said super early in this episode was about police accountability in LA. So there's a news report that's playing, and it's from, I think, the late 80s. And the news report says, quote, police accountability takes a backseat to LA's immense crime problem, which of course it did.
Yes.
Right? It's right out of an authoritarian playbook. Abandon large groups of people, give them no options, and then stir up fear about those people.
Yes.
Which has to be addressed with punishment rather than getting to the root of the problem.
Right.
And so we ignore another problem because we're too focused on this other thing that we created.
Exactly.
The manifestations of the conditions that have been created, we're going to ignore, we're going to focus on the manifestation rather than, again, the root cause.
Right.
And so it's just outrageous to connect that to what you said about that police chief and how he talked about things. And you think about it a little bit beyond the surface, and it's unfathomable.
Yes.
And then we see Skip Townsend, who is based in LA. He's talking about police pulling people over, taking off their shirts and looking for tattoos or other signs of connection to a gang.
Right.
And then they're putting all of those people in a gang database, even if they weren't arrested.
Yes.
Even if they weren't charged with anything, accused of anything, everybody goes in the gang database. And so that everybody's affiliated with a gang somehow. And then you look to today and what's happening with MS-13, and you see the same things happening again, right? So I wanted to make that parallel too of what was happening then is being repeated in a slightly different way now. And so anyway, we see how far police or government accountability to Black people in LA was really just ignored.
Absolutely. Yeah. Well, and it's so funny. I had forgotten about that quote, that news story, and just the idea. I think I chuckled when the headline was "Police accountability takes a back seat." I'm like, what police accountability? Like, when is that
were
ever?
Y'all were doing that?
Yeah. What? But yeah, all of that was really difficult to watch. In particular, the piece about, police basically just arresting everyone that they saw and labeling anyone and everyone part of a gang. Like, just none of that is acceptable. None of that is okay. And all it did was reinforce the problems. And it was just truly shameful for me. So speaking of the gangs, one of the highlights of this episode was actually learning more about how the gangs in LA realized that they needed to work together to bring about change. They were sort of living in these conditions and dealing with the police antagonizing them and arresting them. And with the help of the leadership of Michael Zinzin, who was featured in this film, he founded an organization called the Coalition Against Police Abuse. They entered into a truce and a peace treaty, and we saw them talk to each other, be in community with one another, and we saw the incredible impact that had on the community as a whole, which was really great to see. But then it all crumbled, right? Because the police decided that they had had enough of that and began to instigate and meddle in it. Like, there was a quote about one of the police officers saying that, overtime pay, right? And I put my daughter through school or something, he said.
He said he made, I think, a base salary of 50 something and then another 100 something on overtime pay.
Overtime pay, right? And so, of course, the police are invested in making sure that things go back to the way that they were. And so one of the things that actually stood out to me was one of the panelists on Michael's show that was featured at the very beginning of this episode. The man's name was Dwayne Holmes, and he said, quote, "Until there is a willingness by the powers that be to allow us to sit at that table, to express our ideas and our concerns, and those concerns be taken legitimately, we're going to continue to see the type of violence that we've been seeing in our communities." And he was 100% correct there, right? There's so much possibility for real, necessary, important change when we as citizens have a say in what goes on in our communities. And in particular, when our elected officials and leaders work with us to understand the needs of our communities and put money towards that and resources towards that. Yeah. And so for me, it was just really great to learn about that truce because I didn't know the extent of that history in that moment. And it was also really great to learn from, honestly, the brilliance of those gang members and the ways in which, they were featured in interviews. They were featured with Maxine Waters. I mean, there was just so much brilliance in what they understood about what the police were doing and the situation that they were in, that it was just fascinating to learn from.
Yeah, I really appreciated seeing Maxine Waters walk through the neighborhoods,
hugging people, talking to people,
and it added some extra knowledge for who I know her to be.
Absolutely,
right? From some other key news moments in the past few years. But another key moment for me in the second half of the episode was when Kim Taylor Thompson was talking about how police operated in D.C. as they were addressing drug use.
Right.
And so she said police would come into black neighborhoods and operate as though they were occupying forces. And you had Operation Clean Sweep, where you just swept large numbers of people into a dragnet.
Right.
And so she says that, and then we see footage of raids that seem to just catch anyone who's on that street.
Anyone, yep.
That the cops decide to target. And so they pick a street, and everybody gets picked up. And then we hear from Robert Wilkins, an attorney, who tells his story of being detained outside of Cumberland, Maryland, simply because he was black. He was pulled over for speeding, and instead of receiving a ticket and being told to slow down in the future, which they always like, slow down. He was held for a search by drug dogs.
Right.
And so we see that there are all these avenues for police to enforce drug laws with a sweeping nature.
Yep.
And Robert Wilkins tells the story of having, because he sued, and having part of discovery, he received a document from, I think, the Cumberland City Police Department or something.
Yep.
Basically, it was a directive to pull over all black people who come through Cumberland, Maryland, which is wild that somebody wrote it down and put it on official letterhead
and sent it out.
And they were trying to deal with a drug issue, and that was the way that they wanted to deal with it. And so you see that just they had created this fear around drug use, around all of that, and then figured out we're going to address it as strongly as we can without any real thought process. There's no critical thinking on how we can actually address this. It's just we just need to catch up all these people and arrest them.
Yeah.
And that'll put a stop to it somehow.
Yeah.
Which, if you think about it, that doesn't do anything.
Not at all.
There's no treatment there. There's nothing to actually address what's happening for people and why it is that they're maybe self-medicating or maybe trying to participate in an informal economy because the formal economy has locked them out.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, the Robert Wilkins story was wild, and it was a real visceral reminder. One in particular for me, I mean, it was a difficult moment to watch because I too have been pulled over by the police in a car full of other black men, and so that was really difficult to sort of sit through and watch, and also to listen to Robert then recount how he's an attorney, right? And so he talked to the police as they were pulling them over or after they had pulled them over and said, like, I know my rights and you can't do this. And yet he was still arrested, and that all still happened. And the piece about the mandate, it's just shameful. So that was a wild part of this episode to watch. Another sort of, I keep using the word shameful piece of this episode was the part that featured Reggie Walton, who was the deputy drug czar in Bush's, this is Bush number 1, his war on drugs. He was being interviewed about the federal government's new drug strategy in part, to expand the number of jails and prisons in the country by upwards of 85%. Like, think about that, 85%. And his response to me, just like I think I had to pause it and walk away. He talked about how the United States should have been building prisons in the 50s and the 60s and the 70s because, and I quote, a lot of the criminal element started to disrespect the system because they felt that there were not going to be consequences. Yeah. I think we need to make more people accountable for their conduct. For me, it's the disdain that our government officials had for people and the way in which the only solution that they could offer was more prisons. That, to me, was just insane. And We knew it then, we know it now. More prisons, more prisoners hasn't solved and will not solve the problems we face, right?
It sure won't.
Yeah.
It sure won't. All right. Well, let's talk about application.
Okay.
How do we apply what we've learned from this episode in our discussion to our day-to-day lives and work? We're going to solve the problem here. That's what we're going to do.
Let's do it.
My application is related to Skip Townsend.
Yes.
So I mentioned him earlier. He talks about how people say that black folks in neighborhoods like Watts in LA are like crabs in a barrel. And he makes the point that crabs aren't supposed to be in a barrel. And I think this is one of my sort of philosophies for solidarity, because in a sense, we're all crabs in a barrel. And the people who put us in the barrel give us different value on our lives. So some of us get fed a little bit better. Some of us get some perks. Some of us are the favored crabs, right? Where we get sold for more money at the market. And some of us get neglected and just left to fend for ourselves in the barrel, so to speak. And then when we can see that our enemy isn't one another in the barrel.
Yes.
When we can recognize that those weirdo billionaires and the authoritarians who put the barrel together and put us in the barrel are our actual enemy.
Right.
When we can see that, I think then we're onto something really powerful.
Yes.
And it's grounded in a solidarity of understanding that, yeah, this is the barrel is the conditions we've been put in, but we didn't put ourselves here.
Yeah. We don't want to be here.
Yeah. And what happens if we all get our little crab claws together and start attacking the edges of the barrel? Do we get out? I think we get out.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, I think that made me think about expanding on that and thinking about solidarity too.
I love that.
His little moment about crabs in a barrel. But
yes.
Anyway, what about you?
That's powerful for sure. I love that. My application is somewhat related to that, actually. It comes from a quote that was said in a piece of archival footage that was featured in the episode of a rally that James Foreman Sr. attended. And this is a quote from him. So James Foreman Jr. is an attorney and legal scholar and was one of many incredible folks featured in this episode. And he talked about how, he was inspired to engage in social justice work because of his parents, who were an interracial couple who met during their time organizing for SNCC, which I thought was just pretty cool. But in this archival footage of this rally, James Foreman Sr. said, quote, and heads up to folks listening, maybe you got kids in the car, there's an expletive in here, so I just wanted to name that. Quote, if we can't sit at the table, let's knock the fucking legs off.
Yeah.
And I hollered at that moment. I loved it, right? And when I think about the incredible organizing that Michael Zinzin did and the LA gang members did and the work of just all of the activists and organizers and organizations across our history, have done to fight for justice, I think that quote says it all.
Yes, yeah. And I see how it's connected to crabs in a barrel.
There you go.
I'm going to knock the legs off of the table. All right, well, let's talk about homework.
Yep.
This is where we talk about what we want to do to continue learning and our learning and unlearning work beyond our conversation today.
Yes, sir.
My homework is, of course, to continue watching this series. We've got 4 more episodes to go.
Yes.
The next one is about the Million Man March, which took place in 1995. So I'm sure we'll watch that soon.
Absolutely.
I also want to read one of the books by James Foreman Jr., who is featured in this episode you just mentioned. His father,
Yeah.
he wrote a book called Locking Up Our Own, Crime and Punishment in Black America. And this description says, quote, he seeks to understand the war on crime that began in the 1970s and why it was supported by many African-American leaders in the nation's urban centers.
Yes.
And so that just seemed like a fascinating thing to read and learn more about, is how people got into power and became black mayors, black officials, and just cheered on that same kind of war on crime, on drugs, and what that has done to our country.
Yeah, the episode touches on that a little bit, but read a whole book about it would be amazing. So I love all of that homework for sure. We're definitely going to continue to watch this docuseries. My homework is to look more into the work of Michael Zinzin and the Coalition Against Police Abuse organization, because it seems like they were powerful forces in the fight for social and racial justice in LA back in the 1980s and 90s. And so I want to see what more they did and just what more I can learn about them and from them.
Yes. Yeah, they seem to be doing a lot of great stuff.
Absolutely.
All right. Well, Damien, you're up next time.
Yes.
What do you bring to the table in our next episode?
Well, technically, I am up from our next episode, but we're actually going to be taking a week off for a much needed vacation.
Surprise.
Put the air horn on. Well, he wasn't ready, folks. So, yes, he was. So, what I'm bringing to the table for you, my friend, and me, and for everyone listening is a hope that we can all find some time to rest in the coming weeks. Yes. Oh, wow, that goes on for a while.
Yeah.
Wow.
It's almost done. There's a lot of cheering.
Something to not cheer about. 2025 has been a wild ass year for sure. And so I think we all deserve to take a breath. And so that's what we're doing next week. So there won't be a live episode next week. But then the month comes to a close and we've got to talk about our May book, which actually is yours.
True story.
So why don't you intro that for us?
I guess I will then.
Okay.
Yeah. I am bringing Perfect Victims by Mohammed El Kurd, which is an incredible book. It flips so many assumptions that are baked into the discussion about Palestine on their head. And Robin D.G. Kelly said this about the book: Mohammed El Kurd has written a new discourse on colonialism for the 21st century. And here's one little snippet from the description on Haymarket's website. How we see Palestine reveals how we see each other, how we see everything else. Masterfully combining candid testimony, history, and reportage, Perfect Victims presents a powerfully simple demand: dignity for the Palestinian. And so I've finished reading it a few days ago, and it's really, really great. I'm looking forward to talking about it here with you next time on May 28th.
I love that. Yeah. Well, I'm glad you finished it. I've got a long way to go. That's what vacation is for.
Yeah.
But so far, so good. So I'm really looking forward to that. Very good. Let's do it.
All right. So with that, we want to thank you for joining us today. You know what I'm going to ask you to do here, but in case you forgot, please follow, leave a rating and review, share our podcast with the people in your life. Follow us on social media, including Instagram, TikTok, and Blue Sky. Check us out on YouTube and sign up and join us on Patreon to get notified about any new things we've got going on behind the scenes.
Yes. Thank you for listening. And remember, it's not about us, but it is about all of us. And we'll talk to you in a couple of weeks.